Hi everyone, welcome to the part 2 of the Linux Essentials full course provided by Network Elite. I hope you keep watching this course till the end to be ready for your exam. So please subscribe to this channel and write down your favorite next IP topic below. Software is a type of intellectual property that is governed by copyright laws and in some countries patent laws. As a general rule, this makes it illegal to copy software unless you are the software's author. Open source software, however, relies on licenses, which are documents that alter the terms under which the software is released. As described in this video, open source licenses grant additional rights to software users. In general, open source software owes a great deal to three organizations: the Free Software Foundation, or FSF, the Open Source Initiative, or OSI, and the Creative Commons, or CC. Each organization has a distinct philosophy and role to play in the open source world. In this part, we are going to talk about software licenses, copyright, and also the open source world. As you see, we discussed about investigating software licenses, looking at the Free Software Foundation, looking at the Open Source Initiative, and using open source licenses. Copyright law has existed for centuries, and as such, it wasn't designed with software in mind. Nonetheless, copyright law does apply to software. Licenses that authors apply to their software interact with copyright law to create the specific rights that you have and you don't have to use, modify, and redistribute software. Copyright laws vary from one country to another, but most countries signed the Berne Convention, an international agreement that requires countries to recognize one author's copyrights. In most cases, you don't sign such a license, although in some cases you must click a button to accept license terms. In the past, licenses were sometimes printed on the boxes in which software was distributed. Such licenses are often called End-User License Agreements, or EULAs. Click-through licenses, shrink-wrap licenses, or click-wrap licenses also called. Open source software generally comes with a license in a file, often named copying. Software licenses can modify copyright terms by making terms either more or less restrictive. For example, the General Public License (GPL), which is the license used by the Linux kernel, grants you the right to redistribute the software, including both the source code and binaries. This represents a loosening of the restrictions provided by copyright law. Now let's look at the Free Software Foundation. The FSF advocates what it calls free software, which it defines as freedom to do things you want to do with the software, not the piece of the software. A common phrase used to make this distinction clear is free as in speech, not free as in beer. The FSF defines for a specific software freedoms. One is freedom to use the software for any purpose. The second one is freedom to examine the source code and modify it as you see fit. The third one is freedom to redistribute the software. And the last one is freedom to redistribute your modified software. The point of all this talk of freedom is to empower users, not just developers or companies. If you can modify a program that does almost what you want it to do so that it does exactly what you want it to do, the fact is a big advantage compared to a proprietary program. The legal expression of the ESF's principles come into the form of the GPL, sometimes called the GNU GPL. Two current versions of the GPL are common, version 2 and version 3. Both versions of the GPL apply the four freedoms of the ESF philosophy to the licensed software. Many companies make Linux distributions, and some use Linux kernels that incorporate bug fix patches. These kernels, like the mainstream Linux kernel, are all available under GPL. No company could legally release a redistribution based on a patched Linux kernel and then refuse to make its kernel patches available. A variant of the GPL is a lesser GPL, or also called LGPL. Developers often use LGPL with libraries, which are collections of code that can be used by other programs. For instance, Linux libraries implement the features that create dialog boxes and menus. Many GUI programs use these features, and placing them in libraries not only helps programmers but also reduces the size of the program that use them. What is open source and how to define open source software? The OSI's creators designed their organization as a way to advocate for free software by using a new term open source and by softening some of the ESF's moral imperatives. The OSI aims to promote open source software in a business world. The biggest philosophical difference between the ESF and the OSI is reflected in a GPL requirement that derived works also be distributed under the GPL. The OSI does not object to such a path, provided the software was licensed in a way that permits it. The ESF, on the other hand, explicitly forbade such appropriation of proprietary uses in its GPL. Now, what are the principles of open source software? Free redistribution. The license must permit redistribution, including redistribution as part of larger work. The second one is source code availability. The author must make source code available and permit redistribution of source code and, if applicable, binary code. The third one is automatic license distribution. The license must apply to anybody who receives the program without needing a separate agreement. The other one is lack of product specificity. The license must not require that the program be used or distributed as part of a larger program. That is, you may extract a single program from a larger collection and redistribute it alone. Lack of redistributions on other software. The license must not impose restrictions on other software that's distributed along with the licensed software. And the last one is technology neutrality. The license must not be restricted based on the specific technologies or interfaces. Finally, the last part of this tutorial is about using open source licenses. The major open source licenses include GNU, GPL, and LGPL, which the Linux kernel uses the GPL v2 or version 2, and many other Linux tools use the GPL either version 2 or version 3. Many Linux libraries use the LGPL. The other one is BSD. The Berkeley Source Definition or BSD licenses are used by the open source BSD OSs and by various software components developed for them. Unlike the GPL, the BSD licenses allow modifications to be distributed under other licenses. The latest versions of this license are similar to the MIT license in brevity. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, was the original moving force behind the X Windows system, or X for short, and the MIT license continues to be used for Xorg, X11, the implementation of X that is still included with several Linux distributions. However, some Linux distributions have moved from X to Wayland, which also uses the MIT license. The last one is Apache. Like the BSD and MIT licenses, Apache license is an open source license that permits redistribution under the same or another license. As the name implies, the Apache license originated with the Apache web browser. However, it's used by many other projects as well. Linux distributions include an installation program, configuration programs, and the like. These tools are usually all that a distribution packager can lay claim to in terms of copyright. Most distribution maintainers have made their installation and configuration routines available under GPL or some other open source license, but this isn't always the case. Such details can turn what might seem like an open source OS into something that's not quite fully open source. Because a complete Linux distribution is composed of components using many licenses, it's not useful to speak of single copyright or license applying to the entire OS. Instead, you should think of a Linux distribution as a collection of products that comes with a unifying installation utility. Okay, this tutorial ends here. I hope this is informative for you, and please remember to subscribe this channel and like the video. Thank you.